IMF ge delegation na MMA ge paratum mi para September and 26 September raje wada beyfulhun ge article para ge darum mi hatari ge darum member gaumuthuge Igthisaadhi halat denegatu mattaka uraba datureka maudmenna MMA mawduma debahani mi baddalum mi beyfulhun baddhalukurehvun bebe joint committee baddalum mi marodu iduttena membarunna furtama edin beenumani anudu mi joint committee lead kurumaga evve simbarakke yutira dettonu tanetto nekkamanya anudu hisabun ebetto alu madu dehema anudu hisab kuriye gendane manudu secretariat dannawan mi ebefuna dannawan shukriya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like to welcome IMF delegation to our joint committee. It represents Economic Committee and Public Accounts Committee of People's Majlis. And IMF delegation includes head of mission, Tidian Kind, and Ritu Basu, senior economist, and Emmanuel Kitsios, economist, and Yishi Su, economist, Ali Abdul Rahim, Advisor to Executive Director. We have set up this meeting in accordance with a request we received on 5th September 2022 from Maldives Monetary Authority with regard to your visit to Maldives from September 12 to 26th. We've been informed that this visit is with regard to Article 4 of IMF, which requires IMF to study the economic situation of its member countries and advise them on your findings. So after this introduction, I would like to give the floor to the delegates to inform the members of the committee with regard to your visit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, honorable members of parliament. Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure for the team to be here. So my name indeed is Tidiane Kinda. I'm the IMF mission chief for the Maldives. So I'm here with my colleagues that you already introduced, so no need to go back to that. So in terms of the meeting, so what we would like to do, if of course it works with you, is to present to you first what we see as the global and regional economic context. So that essentially lays the ground in which Maldives operate. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about how we see the economic outlook for Maldives. And then the third topic that we could touch upon is how we see the key issues, the key economic issues in the country. And we would like on that point to get also your views, so that it is interactive. If you can tell us what you see as key issues, economic issues in the country, and what do you see as way forward. So if fine with you, maybe we could start with a global economic and regional context, and then we can follow up with other issues. Is that okay?
Please go ahead with the presentation.
So essentially, Maldives operates in a global context, right, which is a world economy and also a regional context, essentially the Asia and Pacific. So what we see, and this is some forecasts from the July World Economic Outlook that we will revise for October, but they are still very valid, and we can use them for our discussion. So overall, what we see in the global economy is that some risk that we had forecast for many months, if not years, are materializing. So now, of course, we still have risk, but what we really see prominently is a materialization of many risks. And clearly, that comes to everybody's minds, the global inflation surprises. So we're expecting inflation prices to increase, but in most parts of the world, we did not anticipate that significant price pressure. So that is really one large shock that we see materializing. So the second one is, obviously, none of us anticipated a war in Ukraine, and that is having many implications for countries around the world. So one implication is obviously inflation, so it's adding to the existing price pressure that existed even before the war, so it's being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. The second implication of that war is really lower external demand from Europe, which is the continent where the war is taking place, and that is very important for Maldives in a sense that about 50% of tourist arrivals from Maldives are from the European continent. So the third risk that is materializing, also very important for Maldives, is the faster than expected monetary policy normalization, which is a consequence of the higher price pressure that I just mentioned. So one key implication for that, and that is impacting Maldives, is that it's leading to higher financing costs. So the cost of borrowing is significantly much more now than it was about a year ago. This is not only for Maldives, this is for all countries, and in particular all emerging countries. And just as an illustration for that is that if you look at the market rate of the sukuk that Maldives issued at around 10%, is trading at about a double now, close to 20%. So that just gives you an indication of the type of financing cost pressure that most emerging markets, including Maldives, are facing. So the last risk that we mentioned many times, and that is also materializing, is a sharp slowdown in China and also in Europe, in particular in China, with many reasons. And that will obviously have an impact on countries in the world, and of course in Asia as well, including Maldives. So taking all these risks materializing into account, what does it mean? So it does mean that the global outlook is quite precarious. So what we see is growth slowing across the board, and going forward we see a likelihood downward revision in many countries, so even from where we are now. So if we look at the table, you will see that there what we have is growth forecast for the world economy, which is the first bubble, for advanced economies, the second bubble, for emerging market and developing economies, and then for three systemic economies or grouping, the US, the Euro area, and China. So obviously 2020 was the year of the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, so across the board, almost for all countries, with the exception of China, we had an economic recession, a sharp one, which was followed by a recovery across the board for all countries or groupings. Now, if we look at 2022, what we will see is some stabilization of growth, right? Because we have a sharp slowdown, a recovery, so it's normal that growth stabilizes a bit in 2022. But what is more important, and that essentially what I was alluded to, is what we see growth, where we see growth in 2023. So if you look at in the world economy, you will see that the forecast for 2023 is a slower growth. So for the world, for advanced economies, for emerging market, the growth is about the same or slightly higher, but as I said, the trend is of reduction of the growth outlook. So for the US, for Euro area, and with exception again of China. So essentially what it means is that 2023 will be a relatively more difficult year. So that's one. And the second point is that even these forecasts that you see that are based on July numbers are likely to be revised downward for many countries. So a very difficult period ahead of us in terms of the global economy and to some extent the regional economy. So what does it mean for Maldives? So what we expect for Maldives is for 2022, and we see that already in the tourism number, Maldives is in a relatively good position in the sense that the country has managed quite successfully, one should say, to diversify the source countries for tourism. So during the war in Ukraine, what happened is that Maldives was able to switch arrival from Russia to other European countries, and India always being an important buffer country for tourist arrival in the Maldives. So that has supported growth strongly in 2021 and will continue to do so in 2022. So we're still working on our numbers, and but we do see a relatively strong growth in 2022. And by strong, I mean something that will be somehow close to 9-10% of GDP growth. So obviously that will be supported by, as I said, a strong recovery in tourism. One thing that is also important to mention is the outlook for inflation. So around the world, inflation has picked up. Inflation price pressure are increasing. And in the Maldives, what has happened is that price subsidies has allowed inflation to remain relatively contained. And of course, that comes with a significant budgetary cost. So what we see going forward is that it will be relatively difficult to maintain those price subsidies because the cost of them will keep increasing, considering that overall the global price pressure will continue to mount. So we do expect inflation to pick up, and that will be underpinned by rising commodity prices. So while I say that the economic outlook for Maldives is relatively strong because of tourism, we do see significant downside risk. And you'll remember that I mentioned that Maldives tourism depends about half. So it's essentially about 50% of arrivals in Maldives come from the European continent. And what we are projecting, be it starting with the war in Ukraine to the energy crisis in Europe, so these are expected to weigh on European economies. And by that transmission channel, what we expect is that it may have some impact also on Maldives tourism. Even though, as I said, there is a mitigating factor in the sense that Maldives has been able in the past to switch source countries, but this is still a significant downside risk that we see going forward. So the second risk is obviously the very expensive financing costs, which limits option for the government to tap on international market and finance the deficit. So there are other risks. Of course, the pandemic is not fully behind us, so we expect not it to come back, but there is still a risk that a new virus strain, more contagious, could have some impact on the recovery. And Maldives has benefited from the fact that it has a relatively unique position in the global tourism market, with a one resort, one island sort of structure. But as other economies open up, so it could also lead to some diversion of tourism from Maldives to these countries which were relatively close. And particularly, one can think of countries in Asia, for instance. Thailand could be one example in that respect. So overall, what do we see? We see strong growth in Maldives, but we see also significant downside risk. So that brings us to the third point, where I will finish and then pass it over to you to some comment, is the fiscal, where we see the key policy priorities. So one thing that we notice is that despite the strong economic growth, so fiscal vulnerabilities have continued to increase. And by fiscal vulnerabilities, what we mean is essentially the level of the deficit, which remains relatively high, and the level of debt, which also remains relatively high. So we do see as priority going forward the need to restrain the size of the spending, and that will help reduce the deficit. Of course, actions also in terms of revenues are also welcome, to increase revenue, reduce expenditure, with the main goal really to reduce the fiscal deficit and ultimately the public debt to GDP ratio. So one, if I may sort of put on the table two areas where your views would be welcome. Of course, you can also react on other issues that you see important, is that where do you see the areas where the government could be taking action to reduce spending? So that will be welcome. And second, related to that, one thing that we also notice is the link between the spending and the SOEs, so the state-owned enterprises. So where do you see as key area for reform in the state-owned enterprises? What are the priorities you see? And that will help the government also to contain the size of spending. So with that, let me thank you again for your time, your attention, and I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will give a small brief of how I'm going to take the meeting on from here. I would give opportunities to Member of Parliament who would like to ask any questions that they might have with regard to the discussed areas. So I'll open the floor to members. I will now give the floor to Honorable Member Abdullah Jabir from Kahidu constituency.
Very good morning to you all. I just want to understand, of course, IMF is guiding, the World Bank's guiding, Maldives, governments, different times. My being on and off Parliament here, this is a couple of times we are meeting. Explaining, my question number one, how can we compare Thailand and Maldives? We have always come up with good programs. I believe IMF and World Bank should have design package for this type of economy. We are suggesting this way or that way. Now, for example, the areas where we make revenue. Now we are allowing law number 2/99, tourism law, when it was at the beginning, very small time frame. The areas the businesses should work here. Maldives don't own anything. Investors' protection must be guaranteed. Bring in billions of dollar investments. Liberal business policy must be adopted. This is where I think the suggestions should be in these discussions. For the sake of discussions, for example, now our fisheries industry, we are unable to export and take our fish the way we want because there is a regulatory framework than European Union. We should protect our environment and we should not catch our fish. This is the one area we have to look at. And I think suggestion from IMF and World Bank, that would be helping. See, in this very moment also, pandemic situation, we have managed very well. We were in the parliament day and night, we guide the government. The president was very keen, taking the risk, opening our borders, bringing the tourism back normal very quickly. I think we have to do applause to the industry, and gold class certificate I expect from IMF and World Bank to the Maldives. Our rating should go up because there are a lot of industries we have not tapped in. For example, gaming and entertaining, casino. This is going forward. Now, billion-dollar investments we are bringing. We are selling alcohol, pork on a resort, on a license based. So now the gaming, casino is going to happen. So how many revenue can that be doing? And training our people. And more importantly, we should be able to buy and sell the land. For example, one should understand, if we invest our bank, the bank is telling, okay, you are not the owner of the land. So the risk, for example, we have a lease. We don't buy a land. So the government always is the owner of everything. My question is, why we have not suggested IMF, World Bank, when the framework understanding to make the administration to more flexible on the businesses, open businesses. And if that is the case here, we don't need to borrow money from any other country. Sukuk should not be sold 10 and making 20% today. We are a well-fit country, I believe. The only thing is we should be more educated. In the experience we have made in the Maldives, our own economy, we are running our own shoulders. We were not getting any assistance during this period more than what we have generated. And we are self-sustained economy. That's what I would like to say. And thank you very much. Going forward, more questions I will ask. Thank you very much once again. Good morning.
Would you like to?
Whichever way you would like to proceed, I can go question by question. I can take up a few questions and answer.
Better go question by question.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Honourable Member, for your question. I think this is a good one in terms of how the private sector, essentially, if I want to summarize, it can have a higher contribution to Maldives' economy. And this is an area where we also see as priority, because of what we have noticed in the Maldives. I should start by saying that Maldives' story is a relatively successful story in terms of tourism. And if we focus on the most recent period, it's even a more successful story, because if we compare Maldives' tourism recovery to other countries, you will notice that Maldives is almost at pre-pandemic level in tourist arrival, or very close to that, 94–95%, while in many other countries, they are still way below that. So that's definitely an important positive point that we do recognize that Maldives achieved, and we, of course, praise the government for that, because it's a combination of many things, right? The health policy, the decisive health policy during the pandemic, and the economic support. So that we recognize. What we do notice also that we should also recognize is that Maldives has relied quite a lot on state-owned enterprises. And by doing so, of course, the country has achieved a relatively higher level of income, but going forward, that is limiting.
Can we take a break till the prayer?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is a very good call.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Honduras.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Please.
So essentially what I was saying is that Maldives was successful in bringing in tourism, recovering fast, but the role of the public sector is quite prominent, and that essentially crowd out space for the private sector to fully blossom. And what you did mention in terms of the importance of human capital, we fully agree with that, and we also think that in order to create a conducive environment for private sector development, there is room for the government essentially to probably make space in areas where the private sector could take more responsibilities. And one area, for instance, that one may consider could be the housing sector in the greater Mali, where it seems like there is demand, there is enough transaction where the private sector could take a bigger role, and those resources, or part of them at least, could be reallocated to more priority areas like human capital, for instance. So we do definitely recognize that improving the environment for the private sector development is key, and that essentially what has helped Maldives achieve what Maldives has been able to achieve so far. And going forward, that's probably the best route to take going forward. So I think I can stop here. In terms of specific reform that you mentioned, be it investor protection, we fully agree with that. Land reform is an area where we don't really have expertise to say specifically which type of land reform will be more appropriate or not, but definitely creating a conducive environment to allow the private sector to fully flourish will help Maldives going forward. So, thank you.
Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Honorable Member Hassan Nafi from vafudhuge constituency.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to ask from honorable members of the IMF mission. According to the media report in the Maldives, I understand that IMF has advised the government to increase the tax, especially the GST and general GST. Now, the global economy, according to your presentation, is not very pleasant. The growth is not, it is very gloomy. And especially the areas where we get the tourists, European Union, and China, which has not started, though we had the number, China was the #1 market for the tourist arrivals. So when these are like this, and also we are almost 100% import-based country. For everything we need, we had to import that. Global inflation, that increases our costs. And again, when the product that we sell, we increase the price, now again, the cost is going to double it. So, according to normal economic principles, the elasticity of demand is going to be affected. When there is a price hike, the demand for that will fall. So, what is the principles behind that you expect we will have a growth next year in tourism? Because almost our 80% of our economy depends on tourism. The global economy is very gloomy, as according to your president, also according to other reports that we receive, especially Europe, and then the other areas, for example, if Europe, it includes UK, then Germany. Now, the other area we have seen increase is India. Even India is going to be affected with the global inflation. And if we again increase our product price, then the demand will fall. So what is the principle that you have asked the government to increase the TGST and also general GST? When you increase general GST again, it will be, the inflation will rise. And I don't believe that you have been given the right figure of the inflation, real inflation in the Maldives. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable. This is also an important question. And I think in order to answer to the question, I would like to sort of elaborate a bit on two key pillars. One is the structure of the economy in Maldives. So as I mentioned in the presentation, in Maldives, price subsidies have essentially disconnected, in a way, the global price pressure, so the global inflation, to the price pressure that we see, or the inflation that we see in the Maldives. Obviously, we work with the numbers that are published, with official numbers. So, and it's based on that we do our analysis and recommendations. So if you look at these numbers, you will see that as of June, and particularly as of July, inflation in Maldives is less than 3%. I believe it was about 2.5%. While globally, inflation is relatively high. So in the U.S., for instance, at some point inflation reached 8%. So if you look at in other countries, you'll see significant price increases. And Maldives has been able to maintain that low inflation because of price subsidies, for instance, for fuel, electricity. And that has a cost. Right. So it means that the cost for the government to be able to maintain these has increased. So that's one pillar. The second pillar is that, as I mentioned, fiscal vulnerabilities are relatively high in the Maldives. So the deficit is elevated, the public debt is elevated. And if you translate that into borrowing costs for Maldives, you will see that it's essentially doubled. Of course, it's not only that. There is a global phenomenon of higher borrowing costs, which is not related to Maldives, but the fact that also Maldives has relatively high fiscal and debt vulnerabilities contributes to that. So there needs to be a balance. Right? So essentially, if Maldives is having this price subsidy, there needs to be finance. And there is a need to have an overall fiscal sustainability, because what we would like to avoid is that Maldives, which has done relatively well in many years in terms of really targeting this higher value tourism, because of fiscal vulnerability and debt vulnerability, find itself in a relatively precarious position, and that means taking reforms. So with GST and with TGST, you are right that it can lead to higher prices, but the way that we see to moderate that is to, at the same time, have targeted transfer to the most vulnerable, because the GST and the TGST is, particularly the TGST, is tax on tourism, right? But having those targeted subsidies will allow the most vulnerable, the poorest of the population, to be protected from the price increase that will happen. On the impact on tourism that you mentioned, one thing that we did mention in our discussion, Maldives is actually uniquely positioned because your tourism is relatively high in tourism. It doesn't mean that there is no impact at all of price increases, but the elasticity of the impact of price increases on tourist arrival is relatively moderate compared to other countries. So in that sense, if we take everything into account, we need to reduce fiscal vulnerabilities, which can have very big consequences for the country. The fact that you have price subsidies that cost money, and the fact that you also have a relatively robust tourism sector, we think that the government approach in terms of increasing the TGST and GST strike the right balance. But we see that as only one step. We also think that reducing spending is as critical. So it's not only about increasing taxes, it's also about reducing spending to further reduce the fiscal deficit and debt vulnerability. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Honorable Ibrahim Rashid from Maaliyath Committe constituency.
Thank you, Chair. That you highlighted regarding that monetary implications and inflation and rising commodity price. That my question is, what changes should be made to the law on public expenditure, means that Fiscal Responsibility Act, to prevent corruption? That's my first question. And my second question is, what are the provisions of the Public Expenditure Act that should be amended immediately now? And third question is, what are the measures that can be taken by financial system to prevent the price of goods and service from rising market? And what is your advice? I need your advice and your recommendations regarding this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Honorable. So maybe I will start by your last question, actually, and then go back to the first one. So in terms of preventing price pressure, I think the phenomenon of price pressure or inflation that we see now is a global phenomenon. So it is impacting all countries around the world. So even market makers, relatively large countries like the US, all countries are essentially receiving those price pressure and don't, of course, there is monetary policy action that they take in order to address those price pressure, but it could have also consequences on the economy. In a simple way, what I'm trying to say is that the price pressure is a global phenomenon. So trying to insulate the economy from that is very, very difficult, if not impossible. And the way Maldives has done it is by providing price subsidy, which is quite costly. And if the price pressure is maintained over time, it will be very, very difficult for the country, particularly given limited fiscal resources, to continue doing that. So what we have advised overall to countries is to allow the price pressure or the higher prices to filter into the economy, and then use targeted transfer, which are cheaper because they target only the most vulnerable, those people in the most need, to help them then face the higher prices. And that's the general policy that we have advised almost all countries actually in the world. So that's the last question that you had. On the first question on public expenditure review and what requires immediate attention, I think here I would also like actually to hear from the honorable members of Parliament. The way we see it is that if we compare public expenditure in Maldives to other countries in the world, and comparable countries, of course, to Maldives, where we see main differences are on capital expenditure, for instance. If I take one example, on average, the level of capital expenditure that we see in Maldives compared to the level of economy is significantly larger than what we see elsewhere. And in our discussion, of course, these are preliminary discussion, what we did notice is that those capital expenditure are also linked to a relatively prominent role of SOEs in the economy. One example, for instance, is the housing sector, where in the discussion we did notice that the government is very active in the construction of public housing, that the public housing is not targeted to those necessarily in need. For instance, in Greater Mali, there is no targeting to just the people who cannot afford the private sector market otherwise. So the public housing is offered to almost everyone. And the second more concerning news is that the delinquency rate in the rental is close to 40%. We feared 37%. So if you link these two, and given the situation in which Maldives is, it's very difficult for the government to afford providing essentially free or almost free housing to the population. That's a very difficult policy that the government will be able to maintain. So that's, for instance, one example. The land, for instance, is not at market price. So there are many aspects in the housing. The second element that we also hear about is, for instance, the public health system. Again, it's not about cutting provision of health care to the population. It's about having targeting system. It's about having a system that incentivizes saving, for instance, by having co-payment, etc. So it's really about finding ways to rationalize the public spending. So be it on infrastructure, I just gave one example, on subsidies. The health subsidies is one. The fuel subsidies also is the same thing. Again, really trying to target the assistance of the government as much as possible, and linking that to a reform of SOEs. These are really areas where we will see as critical. In terms of your question related to governance, so one thing that, if I want to take again an example, is really that having a procurement system that is competitive will help. So essentially having a bidding process that is open to competition, that is publicly available, that is web information is also available to all stakeholders will already be a good step in terms of helping to reduce vulnerabilities in that area. So let me stop here. Thank you, Honorable.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Honorable Mohammed Said from Maavash constituency.
Thank you, Chair. I think first of all, I am the only non-governmental member here, and my colleague Honorable Jabir. So I'll go very specific on two very focused questions you asked, and then I have, if I'm allowed, with time, 8 different questions. If I'm allowed, I said, do you want me to go one by one? Or? Absolutely. Okay. About cost of finance, you just mentioned our input on that. I think IMF has been throughout the years talking about cost of finance to the Maldives, but very few suggestions has come as to what exactly we have to do to reduce the cost of borrowing, for instance. So what we can do or capitalize both in terms of receiving country or attracting finance from elsewhere. I will focus to environment finance, for example. In my observation, it has been a lip service internationally, talking of renewable energy, for instance. Applications are very complicated to bring renewable energy and green finance from Scandinavia, from Europe, Euro area, from United States, or from China or India. It's very complicated. And why do you think is that? And is there any remedy that you, as an international reputed global financial player, can do? That's one question. The other is about SOEs you just mentioned. If you have done an independent observation, you could sense the private airlines are on the growth trajectory. They are increasing their fleet in the past 2 years. In fact, one of the airlines, Manta Air, has declared they are going even international. On the other hand, the only state-owned enterprise, the Island Aviation, is on a downward trajectory where the company is almost bankrupt. What's your observation of that? My third question on this SOE is, I wish you to go and do reference on the Kamandu constituency election, by-election, that the state has gone recently. If I'm not mistaken, unbudgeted billions of rupiah has been pledged politically to win that seat to the government, and it's unbudgeted. What are the precautions you place to stop those ill practices? Number 2, SOEs. Our observations are the jobs, political jobs offered to companies like FENACA, for instance, especially when there is an election, by-election, or WDC, Women's Development Committee, are quadrupled. In this distress, economic distress, what are your observations on this? And once you answer, I have 4 more questions. Okay. My 4th question is, what has the government done with SDF? And the purpose of, the objective of SDF is to create a dollar buffer. 5th question is, debt payments in 2026, do you see it as a distress or one of the biggest obstacles we're going to hit with? And the 6th question is, the foreign debt for recurrent expenditure. If you do your research, you will notice in the last 4 years, government has done borrowings to fill budgetary gaps, especially on recurrent expenditure. what can you do to stop this practice? And then US dollar black market today is 17 rupiah. And it has been throughout the last 2 years. Is this not a sign of distress? My last question for now is, do you see the independence of central bank? Because on overdrawing and money printing, the public finance chair and Minister of Finance decides. There is no role in our observation of central bank. Have you interviewed the central bank governor, and what's his reaction to that? And the last part of this question is the repayment interest rates of the overdrawing facilities of billions decided by, the interest rate is decided by the chair of the Public Finance Committee and the Finance Ministry, not the central bank. And what's your reaction to that? Thank you.
I think I will give answer for the last question that the honourable member has asked. He is accusing the Public Accounts Committee chair, who's me. I have decided the interest rate on the public overdrawing of IMF, which is not true, because it was done through the Public Accounts Committee and with the participation of Monetary Authority Governor and Minister of Finance and the Minister of Economic Development. So that is not true. And quite impressive. I'm quite impressed with the question that the honourable member was asking. Yesterday, by his own party member of parliament, he was accused of spending more than 22 million rupiah to get elected from his constituency. So, quite impressive. Please.
Thank you, honorable members of parliament. So, these are interesting list of questions. So let me try to address them as much as I can. So I believe your first question was on the cost of financing. So, and essentially how the government could reduce that cost. So there are two main ways for that. One is, and I think we need also to look at a bit of what happened before at the history, right? As I said, if one takes historical perspective, Maldives has done quite well. So we have to recognize that. And the COVID shock has been a large shock to the economy, and I think it has disrupted many functioning. But there is also an underlying trend of increased fiscal pressure, so increased fiscal deficit, increased debt. So one clear way to reduce the financing cost is to reduce the financing need. So which means lower fiscal deficit, which is a combination of higher taxes that we're seeing and also lower expenditure. So if you have reduced needs, and if you look at actually before the pandemic, that was the case, where the fiscal deficit was more moderate. So going back to that will reduce need, and of course it will have a direct implication on the financing cost. So you did mention that climate finance is a quite, I will say, disappointing in a way, or at least not raising to the challenge. And I think the international community that recognize that, and there are many initiatives taking place. Of course, there is still need for time to have concrete result on that. This is not an issue that is unique to Maldives. It's unique to almost all countries, particularly island countries that are facing relatively large adaptation needs. So at the IMF, because I can talk of what the IMF does, we have a new resilience and sustainability trust that is taking place, and that will be normally functional at the end of the year, where the IMF provides long-term financing, because so far the IMF has been providing short-term financing. But with this new facility that will come up, the IMF will provide long-term financing to address long-term challenges, including climate challenges. So that's what the IMF is doing exactly to address the question in the true concern that you raised. So in terms of your second bucket of question related to SOEs, how to ensure efficiency and avoid unbudgeted allocation, I think there clearly again there is a need to rationalize the presence of SOEs in the economy. So there are areas where in many countries it takes the SOE to essentially be on the lead because the economic benefit is usually not enough. There is a social dimension that is very important to bring in. But in many countries also what we see is that relying on the private sector, which faces usually more competition, can bring in efficiency. And here I just mentioned one example of the housing sector, and I think there are many other areas in the Maldives. We are not suggesting to completely privatize everything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that by bringing in the private sector in specific areas where there is a private market particularly, that could raise the efficiency of those sectors, and the government could focus and devote more energies to other areas. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention on that. So you asked a question on SDF, and what I can say is that the SDF is indeed a good initiative that the government has. The SDF is in local currency also, so in Rufiya, and having a fund like that in foreign currency, given the exposure and the structure of the economy, will be helpful for Maldives. And the government has requested a technical assistance from the IMF to reform the SDF, and the IMF team is not us, but there are experts at the IMF focusing on that they are in talk with the government to help the government reform that. But overall, what we can say is that SDF is a good initiative, and if you look at the example of Singapore with GIC and Temasek, different structure, but you will see the importance of those funds. So it's critical to have those funds, but it's also important in the case of Maldives to reform them. And then one key reform will be really to help those funds grow, of course, but also grow with foreign exchange, for instance, on dollars. So you mentioned that the debt in 2026, is it a sign of distress? We do recognize that, and I believe that the government also recognizes that 2026 is a year of quite elevated need for refinancing, because some debt are expected to mature with Sukuk, are expected to mature at that time, and the refinancing need is quite elevated. So as Maldives has done in the past, what it means is that preparing to roll over those bonds coming due before they come due. And from our discussion with the government, this is something that we are working on. So it's definitely a large risk that we see going forward. But as of now, we cannot say that it's a sign of debt distress, because in the past, the government has been able also to essentially roll over past bonds that were coming due, and we expect the same thing going forward. But of course, it's a big risk, and it's important for the government to pay attention to it, which we believe the government is doing. Then you mentioned how to increase, how to stop borrowing to finance the fiscal deficit. I think I alluded to that point earlier. We see really two aspects. One aspect is to reduce the financing need. So if you have a lower deficit, you will have a lower financing need, and you may even be able to cover that domestically. But of course, it's also important to Maldives to have access to international market, to keep that access, to have a benchmark, a yield like the Sukuk. So it's not necessarily a problem to tap into the international market, to have access to it, to use it. Many countries do it. The US does it. Many countries, particularly I think I should take example of emerging market. Many emerging markets do it. It's not necessarily a problem. But it's important to have a fiscal outlook and debt outlook that is not too large. And I think that's where we're working with the government and helping the government and supporting the government, I should say, in their own action to achieve that. So borrowing is not necessarily a problem, but the fiscal vulnerability is a problem. And in terms of a parallel market, which is your last point, we recognize that it's relatively large. And when we look at in the past, what we see in the case of Maldives is that there is, of course, the tourism sector that is a main provider of foreign exchange. So the health of the tourism sector has an impact on the parallel market. But there is also a structural level of premium that seems to exist because of the structure of the economy, because not all the foreign exchange goes through the banking sector. And this is also one area where the government has a plan to reform the FX market, that which will help reduce the parallel market rate, and also an area where the IMF is providing support to the government. It's going to be a relatively complex process to bring the two rate down, but there is definitely room to do that. And taking reform will help in that aspect. But one thing, again, coming back to the fiscal sector, is that the elevated fiscal deficit also is a key contributor, actually, to a parallel market, because it put pressure, it increased the need for import, and it put pressure on the exchange rate. So we see really as key priority is to reduce the fiscal vulnerability, reduce the fiscal deficit, and that will help in so many aspects, and one aspect of them is the parallel market. So with this, let me stop here, Honorable, and I hope I covered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Honorable Muhammad Aslam, North Hitadu constituency.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, the delegation from IMF mission sharing your findings, and also your continued help and assistance to the financial sector, to the government of the Maldives. Actually, this committee will also be the budget scrutiny committee, Economic Affairs Committee as well, PAC together. Will be sitting for the national budget of 2023 very soon, by next month, I believe. So this information will be very helpful for us when we scrutinize the national budget as well, especially the main piece of the coming fiscal policy of the government for 2023. My urgent question, I have some comments rather, on the discussion here. Tourism, of course, is doing very well. We will have to give the proper credit to the government as well. During the COVID pandemic, the measures that the government has taken to sustain the tourism as well, by providing financial assistance to the resorts, to the guest house, so on, by upholding and keeping them at survival point. And also by opening the country as quickly as possible is also one factor that we will have to take into note. In addition to that, I have observed that in 2022, one of the leading market was Ukraine. Unfortunately, went on a very unfortunate Russia that decided on that. But still, we have observed that even now, even the last month figure shows Russian market is growing. So this is a positive sign. Hopefully, when the China market opens, it will be better. And my one question is, with 1.4 billion tourists throughout the world, what we are tapping here is 1.5 million only. So there's a huge room for further expansion on tourism. For that, of course, we will need capital investments. Still, there are more than 100 islands being awarded, not being able to tap finance to develop it. So means and ways of finding finance to develop these resorts is also very important. At the same time, the proper infrastructure needed to sustain the increase in tourism figures is also very important. Adequate facilities in the airports, transport mode, and so on. This government is doing a lot to increase number of airport facilities throughout the country, as you know, geographically, the difficulties that we have in transport, and also now started a transport link. I think you will know about it. By when it's completed, the whole country will be linked through this public transport, sea and land as well. So I would like to emphasize on the very positive and productive work the government is undertaking on building its infrastructure. And you have also mentioned about spending on capital expenditure. Of course, for a long period of time, throughout the country, the very basic infrastructure is not being installed. Proper sewerage systems, proper drinking water systems are not being installed in inhabited islands, unfortunately. So the government, I think, gave a huge priority and pledges to the people to complete it. And we have to also take into note that next year is the election year, and there are a lot of pledges, whether the many pledges by the government which needed to be fulfilled as well. So capital investment perhaps will be difficult even next year when we sit with the national budget for the next year, and there will be pressures from all MPs as well, you know, while we discuss about, you know, cutting down the capital investments. At the same time, with the capital investments, of course, the recurrent will come up as well. We'll have to employ more people and so on. So this is a never-ending sort of thing. One area that the government focused was to diversify. Tourism, of course, all agrees that about 80% directly or indirectly dependent on tourism, the whole GDP of the country. So diversifying it into fisheries and agriculture is very important. And again, investments for these proper facilities. Having proper fisheries complexes need huge investments, hundreds of $millions. A proper cannery is about $50 million. So finding that is also one question is, you know, after these findings, what were your recommendations to the government? Additionally, one more. I think this is very important for IMF. What do you think of deregulating, even perhaps, you know, floating the dollars, and in addition to that, we don't have strong regulations comparatively with the exchange, for foreign exchange, very much dollarized economy we do have. So restricting that, perhaps, you know, or in accordance with other economies, what do you think of more regulation, or perhaps, you know, more deregulation on that? I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable. So also interesting questions. So let me try to sort of answer them together because they are pretty much linked. So maybe before that, I mean, in terms of recommendation to the government, I should say that we're still in the first half of our mission, where we're essentially discussing and gathering information before finalizing our views. But obviously, we had views before that remain constant, and those are the ones that I am sharing. So in terms of the importance of tourism for the economy, I mean, we do recognize that Maldives has been quite successful in developing tourism and in developing high-end tourism. And that development also took place on the backdrop of a strong private sector participation, right? The one island, one result system is essentially where the investment, or at least most of the investment, is made by the private sector, and it has been a relatively successful model that Maldives has adopted. So from that, how do we see the way forward? What we see now is that in the recent years, there has been a significant increase in public spending. And probably what you mentioned corroborate that in terms of the expansion of airports throughout the country, expansion of boat linkages throughout the countries. These are commendable, but at the same time, they also need to take into account the resources available in the country. Because if they lead to high deficit, high debt, they increase vulnerabilities and they can lead to more negative consequences. So it's important for the country to, of course, do what is needed to provide services to the population, but do it in a prioritized and over time. So doing it everything together can lead to, as we are seeing the numbers, relatively high deficit and debt. So we're not saying that to not do it, but it's a matter of doing it over time that is important. And when you're talking about more regulation in terms of the dollar, what we see is actually less regulation. And the most important element that we actually see is to link the dollar need or shortage, depending on the way you look at it, to the macroeconomic situation. Because when you have a tourism sector providing dollar for itself, and then you add to that a public sector that is spending quite significantly, those spending of the public sector are associated with elevated demand of dollars, right, that need to be fulfilled. But if there is a more gradual approach to public spending, what it will mean is that the public sector vulnerability, so the deficit will be lower, the debt will be lower, the borrowing cost will be lower, the associated demand for dollars will be lower, and the impact on the parallel market will be lower. So it will all come together. And of course, just to finish with that, Maldives, again, has been successful in the tourism sector, relying on the private sector. So having some support of the public sector is good, but switching it toward more public sector involvement will not necessarily be, at least from our views, the best approach. I think building on what Maldives have done successfully in the past could be quite beneficial for the country. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, thank you very much for
if I may.
Okay, I would like to conclude the meeting. Before I conclude, Honorable MP wants to know how the best practice in other countries with regard to the sale of land. So if you have anything to, into your experience, I think, please share.
Thank you. As I said, we are not really expert in terms of how countries structure sales of land. So what I can say, I am also Deputy Mission Chief for Singapore. I can just give an example of how Singapore does it. In Singapore, they do have sales of land, and the way they do it, they link it to the budget, is that half of the proceed. So 50% of the proceed from sale of land is automatically saved into a sovereign wealth fund. So essentially into the equivalent of the SDF. It's saved. And it's only 50% of the proceed that is used for spending. So that's what I can say, but I believe that the World Bank will be in a better position probably to advise the government on how to structure land sale. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to conclude the meeting. Before I conclude, I would like to assure IMF that as Public Accounts Committee, which is committee is assigned to overlook the government spending and also to put a check and balance on government activities. We assure you that we'll make sure that any resources, regardless whether it's an island or a facility which belongs to the government, before it is assigned to a private party, it should go through a private a competitive bidding process. We'll make sure that it is the process that the government go through before it is awarded. But unlike, it was not the practice which was done in the history through past regimes, but we'll make sure that these competitive processes are followed before any of these government resources are allocated to private parties. And also with regard to the development of housing and mega infrastructure projects, which has been in the past awarded through selective process rather than a competitive bidding process, we will make sure that that practice will not happen in the future. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for sharing